Hey everybody, glad to be here. Yeah, QCon is really one of my favorite conferences of the year. I think Wes asked me to come out here. I flew in from San Francisco to New York, landed this morning. So not only am I happy to be at QCon, I took a taxi straight from the airport, and the taxi drivers out here are insane. So I'm actually happy to be alive. So good to see all of you. One other thing Wes mentioned, and I think is really important about this conference, it's highly technical, and I love geeking out with all you folks, but I also love the fact that there's a track dedicated to management, leadership, scaling as well. That's super important, and that's what my talk is going to be about. And we'll get into it soon. One sec, let me skip these slides here. So my talk is Igniting the Fire. How can we systematically develop leaders as we scale an organization? Because we're engineers, I want to think about this as an engineering problem. Before I get into that, who am I? Nick Caldwell, Chief Product Officer at Looker, now acquired by Google. I'm really excited about that, and buy a whole bunch of new Jordans once that deal closes. Formerly VP of Engineering at Reddit. For those of you, any Redditors in the audience? Cool. All right, yeah, we always get a good turnout when there's geeks. So for those of you who don't know what Reddit is, it's one of the world's largest websites, about 300 million MAU. While I was there, I helped scale that team from about 35 engineers all the way up to about 170 when I left. So we did that over the course of a year and a half. Before that, 15 years at Microsoft, a general manager of a product team called Power BI. Any of you guys familiar with that? Again, kind of an entrepreneurial team where I scaled up the team from really 2 people, and then when I left, it was around 300 folks. Went to some decent educational institutions, I think. And then the other thing I'm really proud about is I'm a board member of an organization called DevColor, and I'll talk to you more about that later. So most of this talk is going to be about scaling teams. I think the best experience I had in that so far, the fastest growth I had was really at Reddit. So I want to talk about some of the challenges we faced there. So when I joined Reddit, the CEO kind of took me aside. He said, Nick, I got a challenge for you. We're hyperscale. We need you to figure out a way to triple the team size as fast as possible. We ended up quintupling it in about a year and a half. But the fundamental goal there was to grow as quickly as possible. Now, the number one challenge that I had when I joined was there were no managers. And so anyone who's had to rapidly scale an organization or build an organization of any type, you've got to think through your management structure. Like, who's going to be in charge of taking care of people, doing the organization, et cetera, et cetera. We had a bunch of people calling themselves tech leads. All right? And tech leads is one of the most nebulous job titles I think I've encountered in this industry. If you talk to 5 companies, you'll get 7 different answers for what a tech lead is. So one of the first things I had to do in order to scale this organization up was to kind of separate out tech leads into 2 groups, managers and architects. And the way that we did this was a technique. You guys seen the movie Blade Runner? Anyone seen that movie? Okay, great. This is a good tech crowd. So if you haven't seen Blade Runner, the gist of it is there's a guy, a detective. He's got to hunt down these robots called replicants. But the catch is these replicants look like human beings, right? So he has to use this test. It's called the Voight-Kampff test. And what he does is he finds someone he's not sure it's a human or a robot. He hooks them up to this machine, starts asking them a few questions to kind of determine human or robot. And if they're human, great, no problem. If they're robot, well, he takes them out back and shoots them. So we decided to do the same thing with our tech leads. So this is an example of the test that we use. Now, mind you, we didn't literally shoot them. And then 2, we didn't literally ask them questions. This happened over the course of several weeks in one-on-ones and just trying to figure out what people are really passionate about. But we asked these sorts of questions. Tech lead comes in. What do you care more about, people or architecture? If you're an architect, this is a pretty straightforward question. If you're a manager, one of your primary responsibilities has to be caring about people. I fundamentally believe that. What are your thoughts on shipping toward a deadline? All right, managers, one of their primary responsibilities, you got to figure out how to have consistent, predictable output. That is a fundamental responsibility for managers. There's architects who I've talked to who will design, redesign, then design again, and they get really passionate about that, you know? Your PM tells your reports immediately to start working on a feature. What do? All right, well, again, managers have to think through, like, how do we get predictable output? They have to manage the engineering team, and if a PM comes and tries to interrupt, you have to kind of take care of that. And then finally, you spend 1 day a week working on recruiting, plowing through LinkedIn profiles, only to be rejected by every single candidate. How do you feel? All right, managers have to do that regularly to try and be involved in building up the team. All right, so we ran this test, and at the end of it, we had some pretty good results. We came up with 20 managers and directors, 10 architects. 50% of those came from within, and after about a year, we had, I would say, a 90% success rate. So this really set the foundation for scaling the team. But it introduced another challenge. And after a year, CEO took me aside, and he's like, hey, Nick, you know, you've done a great job. I think at that point we were up to like 100 people. I said, you've done a great job, but I'm noticing like an interesting problem. It's that we used to, you know, it seems like we're hiring all, or solving all of our corporate problems by hiring more people. And it used to be the case that when we were small, people would step up and lead, all right? You know, if there was a new challenge, they didn't see boundaries. They would just jump in and try and offer their support. But as you get bigger, it seems like we're just throwing more and more people at the problem. And CEO's not wrong. You know, as your company gets bigger, one fundamental thing you have to do is provide specialization and focus. You start to see RACI charts, roles and responsibilities. You start dividing the company up into areas of expertise, and that makes it harder for any one person to switch and jump into an area and help out. A negative way to look at this is it can create politics and boundaries. And I think it also, you know, as you scale up, makes it feel like any one individual doesn't necessarily have a full sense of ownership across the entire company. And this is a dangerous thing. It means that people don't feel that they're empowered to step up into new areas or to take on leadership roles. So this is not good. You know, it means that we're missing an opportunity to develop leaders, or at least there's something in the system that prevents people from feeling like they can continue to be leaders. Impact of missing leadership is obviously bad. I mean, like lower productivity, lower retention, lower development, poor delegation if you don't have other people to push tasks to. There's a survey done by this application called Blind I thought was really interesting. It says, what is the main source of employee burnout in your current workplace? And if you check this chart out, lack of leadership is actually a bigger source of burnout than like giving people lots of work, which is interesting to me. It was pretty surprising. So the question that I have is, and the challenge that I proposed to myself is, how do we scale leadership? How do we make it so that, you know, and if you're a 10-person startup, everyone feels like a leader? How do we make it so if you're a 100-person startup, everyone feels like a leader? And that is the challenge that I wanted to face. Now, so in this talk, I think I've come up with at least 3 different mechanisms that you can use. So I want this to be a really practical talk that gives you guys who are managers tools to take back with you to your teams. And if you're individuals, I'm going to make sure that we give you some tools as well. All right? So there are 3 things that I think we have to explain in order to solve this problem. The first one, and this might be the most important, is the fundamental idea that leadership isn't management. These are not the same thing. And the reason I think this is so important, about 3 months ago, I had one of my mentees come to me and he said, hey, Nick, I want your advice. I was talking to my manager. He said, you know, you're not ready yet to step into a leadership role. Right? I don't know if any of you have ever heard those words uttered, but it implies something that's really fundamentally incorrect. Like one, it implies that your manager has the permission to tell you when you can lead, which I fundamentally disagree with. And then it also implies that in order to be a leader, you have to have a management position, right? So I want to divest you of this notion as quickly as possible, all right? So leadership versus management, all right? Management, if you think about it, managers are responsible, I would say, for a few things. One, people, right, for sure. Like if you're going to be a good manager, you've got to care about people. But there's also a lot of operational process that you're responsible for. You've got to think about predictability, stability. Like really your job as a manager is to take a bunch of people and figure out a way to get them, to inspire them, to produce predictable output, right? You're trying to get high quality, predictable work out the door, right? Nothing glamorous about that. But if you think about like what the role of a leader is, I'm going to claim it's quite different. Like leaders, if anything, are trying to pull you off a predictable course. They're trying to spot the missing opportunity that everyone overlooked. They're trying to use inspiration. They're trying to use empathy. They're trying to use different techniques to change behavior of an organization. Leaders, if anything, are fundamentally destabilizing, and hopefully that's in a positive way. So let's start with that. Leaders and management are going to act in an organization in fundamentally different ways. Now, I tried to find a quote, a pithy quote, which would encapsulate this. Leadership is working with goals and vision. Management is working with objectives. I think that sort of captures it, but it doesn't stick. And like one of the ways I like to make an idea stick is to tell a story about it. So let's switch and tell a story, all right? How many of you folks have heard of the Manhattan Project? Hopefully you've heard of this. Great. All right, so Manhattan Project, one of the most closely guarded secrets of World War II, development of the first atomic weapon. If you go and do research on this, it's really fascinating to look at how big of a logistical problem this was. Most people think like, hey, this was a bunch of propeller head scientists locked in a room just tinkering with stuff and eventually an atomic weapon came out. No, it turns out more than 100,000 distinct companies worked together to build a supply chain, find the tooling, build all of the warehousing. Like 100,000 companies worked together on this project, right? So most people, when they think about the leader of the Manhattan Project, one name comes up. That name is Robert Oppenheimer. He was the chief scientist, and most people think of him as the leader of the Manhattan Project. Now, I want to talk about someone who worked for Robert Oppenheimer. Let's see what they said about him, all right? Let's see. He knew how to organize, cajole, humor, soothe feelings, how to lead powerfully without seeming to do so. He was an exemplar of dedication, a hero who never lost his humanness, all right? And this is my favorite part of this. Disappointing him somehow carried with it a sense of wrongdoing. Los Alamos' amazing success grew out of the brilliance, enthusiasm, and charisma with which Oppenheimer led it. All right, do you guys get that sense? This sounds like a really inspiring, motivating dude, all right? But this was not the guy organizing 100,000 companies and bringing all the supply chain together and figuring out how all this stuff was going to get built. That was a different person. And let's talk about him. His name was Leslie Groves, all right? And this is a really fascinating guy. And I also found a quote about Leslie Groves from one of his advocates. Let's see what they say about Leslie Groves, the manager of the Manhattan Project. The biggest son of a bitch I've ever met in my life. All right, and this goes on. This goes on. He had absolute confidence in his decisions. He was absolutely ruthless in how he approached a problem to get it done. I've often thought that if I were to have to do my part all over again, I would select Groves as a boss, all right? Do you guys get that? Hopefully the distinction is coming across. Now, this is a truly fascinating person, and just as an aside, Leslie Groves was also one of the very, very first proponents of Agile methodologies. So we're using Agile methods to develop nuclear weapons. So definitely read about this dude if you want to learn some organizational and Agile history. So if that story didn't convince you, let's just hit you with a little bit more math. Positional leadership, like the idea that everyone in your org has to be a manager in order to lead, it also just doesn't mathematically scale. Anyone who has built an organization, I guarantee you will tell you the following: all the smart people are on the bottom of the org chart. So if you are trying to get the best out of your team, you have to figure out a way to pull leaders from that pool, all right? And finally, this is actually what people want. Like if you're trying to build a happy, high retention organization, trying to find ways for people to get leadership opportunities actually outperforms monetary incentives as a way to retain them, all right? So this is a survey from 2009 McKinsey Global Survey about employee retention. So to scale, we want to get our employees to look for opportunities instead of positions, all right? Now, I want to give you some tools for this. I want to end every section with a tool. If you're a manager or someone who's coordinating architects or that kind of position, I want to leave this tool with you. It's called Management Breadcrumbs. And the idea here is that at your next stand-up or your next team sync or what have you, you start to find ways to provide visibility into problems that are extending outside of your core group, right? This can be a little bit uncomfortable for managers because you have to have a little bit of vulnerability. You have to say, hey, look, outside of this tight-knit group, I'm also dealing with these other challenges. But it's okay, take the leap. Try and provide visibility to things that are happening beyond your core group that you could use help with. Then invite discussion, and discussion doesn't mean complaining. Discussion means positive, like, try and introduce, like, hey, how would you solve this if you were in my position? Wait and repeat. Like, this doesn't work on the first try remotely because your team has to get used to the idea of thinking more broadly. But I guarantee you, if you do this, for long enough, do it for a few weeks, you'll start to see, someone on your team raise their hand and say, oh, I've got an idea. And then maybe they'll say, oh, not only do I have an idea, maybe I'll spend a little bit of time writing my thoughts down. And then if you get really, really lucky, they'll say, I've got an idea, I wrote my thoughts down, I got someone else to come help me with it. And then if you start to see this behavior, the final thing that you want to do is sponsor it. Now, sponsoring it, doesn't mean necessarily that you fund every idea that comes your way. That can be dangerous. But you do want to reward the positive behavior. Sometimes it's enough to just say in front of a group, good idea, I'm glad you considered that, I'll read your paper, I'll distribute it more broadly. And occasionally you'll have an idea that you actually do want to execute on, all right? So leadership breadcrumbs, a tool for managers. Now for individuals who are looking for opportunities to lead, I have one tool as well. And this is called the golden question. A lot of people ask me, hey, Nick, you seem to have had a relatively decent career. Like, how did you find opportunities? This is the tool that I use. It's actually one of the simplest tools and the most effective. It's the golden question. It is simply asking your manager or your peers or other folks in the organization, what would you do if you had another pair of hands? Like, you'll be stunned at the amount of opportunities that are just laying around for you to pick up if you ask the right person this question. Ask it to yourself at this moment. Like, if someone were to come to you today, like right after this conference, and ask you this question, what are all the things that you want to do if you had another pair of hands? Each of those is an opportunity for you to enable someone on your team with a leadership position, right? Okay, so second idea, I want to move on. Second important notion, if we're going to fix this problem, is the idea that anyone can be a leader, right? Now, do traits define a leader? I believe like an entire industry is trying to convince us that this is the case. And I've got evidence to back it up. And I'm going to talk through why I don't think this is correct. So, do traits define a leader? $24 billion a year is spent on leadership training. I guarantee you that everyone in this room is guilty of contributing to this $24 billion in some way. Let's look at some examples. Okay, books, good to great, 7 Habits of Highly Effective People, spending $20 on that. Conferences, also somewhat expensive, welcome to QCon. Classes, $2,000, all right. Take a little training class on the weekend, all right? But this is kind of entry-level stuff. Let's move on to like the more heavy-hitting things. Leadership seminars, right? For $10,000, you can go to a leadership seminar with Irvin Magic Johnson, Suze Orman, Tony Robbins, Sylvester Stallone, and Pitbull. So if you look at this is not a Pitbull conference. This is not a Pitbull concert. This is Pitbull dancing leadership into the souls of 1,000 people for $10,000. Pitbull. And if you really want to go heavy, you can. This is the granddaddy of all leadership trait training. And if you look closely at these screenshots, you'll see someone who's made this mistake. But for $100,000, you can be certified leader through one of these fine institutions. Okay. So Google, a couple years back, actually did a study. It was called Project Oxygen. And among other things, they tried to determine what the top leadership traits were, right? And it was a really fascinating study. These are the top 5: vision, empathy, empowerment, charisma, and expertise. These are the 5 things that if you want to be a leader, you've got to have those traits. So I thought to myself, as a somewhat skeptical engineer, is this actually true? Like, if I was to take these 5 traits and like apply them to actual tech leaders, would it stand up? Would the experiment be validated? So you guys want to do this with me? All right, let's do it. Let's go through a couple top leaders and see if they fit the bill here. All right, let's start with an easy one. Steve Jobs, all right? Definitely visionary, definitely charismatic, all right? But empowering, no. Like this is a kind of a chart floating around the internet of the Apple org chart where all the lines go to Steve Jobs, all right? Not an empowering individual, all right? Let's try another one. This is a military commando from, sorry, no, this is not a military commando. He's mildly terrifying. This is actually Jeff Bezos. And Jeff Bezos, if you've studied his management philosophy at all, he's very empowering. He's got this whole notion of two pizza teams. He really tries to find ways to empower people at the lowest levels of his organization. It's a really good read if you want to study management approaches. But let's see, empathy? Amazon warehouse workers skip bathroom breaks to keep their jobs, says report. Not very empathetic. And this is one of the nicer articles I could find recently. Let's move on. Now, this is one of my favorites. This is a guy that I really enjoy. Brilliant person, massive expert. This guy's running more companies than I could fit on the slide. Tesla, SpaceX. He's drilling underneath LA. He's landing rockets on the, one of the smartest people out there by far, all right? But maybe burning out a little bit. Maybe this is a person who should delegate a little bit more. And then finally, I think this is one of my favorites as well. Mark Zuckerberg from Facebook, definitely a visionary, brilliant individual. But look, there are listen, there are entire internet communities devoted to trying to figure out whether this man is actually a robot. All right? So the question is, how are you supposed to know? How are you supposed to know? How are you supposed to know that this nerd lawyer or this stoner with the unfortunate hat are actually going to end up both being Nobel Prize winners? And so my claim is that it's not about traits, all right? It's got to be about something else. I'll tell you a quick story, a personal story, because I've made this mistake as well. I hate to show up to conferences and just be like, I know everything. I've made this mistake as well. When I was a young manager, I was trying to hire an architect for one of my machine learning teams. And a guy came in, his name was Tony. He was incredibly quiet, though. Really, really quiet guy. You ever do one of those interviews where you can't even get the person to tell you their name comfortably? It's one of those things where you're really trying to drag something out of someone. But when we got to the coding questions, Tony just blew them away. It's one of those people, you got 5 questions, he finishes them all in 20 minutes, and then you have to invent new ones or stare at each other awkwardly. So when we got around to the hiring panel, it's 5 people on the panel. We go around the room, hire, et cetera. It gets to me, and I'm the hiring manager for this position. And I go, we're not going to hire Tony because he's too quiet. And I believe that an architect has to have a presence. They've got to be loud. They've got to be someone who can get in front of a room and own it, right? Architects and leaders have to have that property. So my manager kind of took me out of the room, and he said an important phrase which I learned, which was, Nick, I'm disappointed. So disappointed, if you guys don't, that's kind of like a millennial for you suck. So anyway, we ended up hiring Tony, and Tony ended up being one of the best hires I've ever made. Just a brilliant guy. He not only brought machine learning techniques to the team, he quickly became a mentor for others, brought TensorFlow into the organization, just a brilliant individual. And many years later, I ended up working with him for 5 years, but many years later, I asked him, hey, during the interview, it really didn't come across that you were going to be this amazing of a leader. What was it about? And Tony told me, he said, hey, Nick, my previous job, which you were asking me about in the interview, my previous job was making control software for washing machines at GE, all right? And the first time I got to work on something I was really passionate about was in your team, and that is what enabled me to become the leader you see today. All right? So that's always stuck with me. So the thing I want you guys to take away from that story is, I think what you really got to look for is not traits, but you got to figure out how to connect people with what they're passionate about. And I'm not the only person who thinks this. There was a 1992 study by Kreifel and Patler, and they did, it was longitudinal, so over the course of 20 years, they started with 1,500 people. They said, would you choose your career for passion or money? And then 20 years later, there were 101 millionaires. 100 of those millionaires chose passion, and only one set out on their career with the goal of making money. So I read about that survey. It's really interesting. So instead of traits, look for passion. I want to give you guys a tool to try and uncover passion with people who work for you or within your organization. Right? So first one, the idea is blue flame. If you guys haven't heard this concept, the blue flame is the idea that you intersect what individuals are passionate about with what your organization needs. And if you can get the overlap of those two things, you get the blue flame, the hottest part of the fire, the highest possible output. And a tool for managers I want to give you is the blue flame chart. Now, the idea is that you use this chart during one-on-ones or discussions with your team. Don't print this out. It would be really awkward. Just keep it in your head, all right? You want to figure out intrinsic motivators. You can ask questions like, what would you do if no one was telling you what to do? What team problems would you try and fix if you were in charge? What do you want to learn, right? These are intrinsic motivators. Extrinsic motivators, what are the major problems faced by our organization or team? What does your manager talk about when he's leaving breadcrumbs? And are there new industry trends that we should be thinking about? These are just some examples. And if you can intersect those two things, you get the blue flame. Now, for individuals, I want to add one other suggestion, which is you're going to add one other circle to this, and that's feedback, 360-degree feedback, because I will claim that most people cannot see themselves clearly, and the best way to get that input is to just ask people who you trust, what do you think I'm good at? Ask someone else what they think you're good at, and I think you'll get the real answer. And if you intersect those three things, you get the hottest part of the flame, you figure out what you're passionate about, and hopefully you can apply it to your job. All right? Okay. Final thing, home stretch, y'all. The final thing is, even if you've got opportunity, and even if that opportunity is something that you're passionate about, you still don't see people popping into leadership mentality all the time. Like, you still need something that sparks leadership. There's got to be like a trigger, and I call that the leadership moment. All right. So, why potential leaders don't spark? This is a pretty good survey from American Management Association, and it gives you the answer pretty directly. The first rule of leadership is everything is your fault. So, fear of being held responsible for failure, like, is the #1 reason that people don't take on leadership opportunities, which is great to know because this is a solvable problem, all right? So the leadership step function, what gets someone from just being a contributor into this leader mentality? Is it training? Is it Pitbull coming to dance that leadership into you? Is it putting pressure? Like, putting pressure on someone will turn them into a leader, but I don't think that's sustainable. Is it mentoring? Everyone's got some moment, though, like some moment where they switched mentality from contributor to leader. For folks in the room who feel like leaders, I suspect if you think about it for a second, you'll recognize that moment in yourselves. Mine was about 3 or 4 years into my career. I was like a new manager, and I was complaining about the PM team, as engineers are supposed to do. And I was complaining to the PM team about, hey, the schedules suck, the features aren't great, we're not being more forward-looking as we should be, we have to do more machine learning projects. And my mentor at the time said, Nick, I want to give you some advice. He said, Nick, you're awesome as a manager, but you suck as a leader. Which was terrible coming from my mentor. It's like a slap in the face. I wish he had just said he was disappointed in me. But what he said was, hey, Nick, all these problems that you're describing, like, who do you think is going to step up and solve them, right? He said, leaders take responsibility for what happens next. And that was the moment everything changed for me. I walked out of his room, I went to the office of my general manager, and was like, hey, look, I'm not real happy with the schedule. I've got some ideas. If you will give me authority, I would like to start a small team and go do a few prototypes, et cetera, et cetera. Somehow the general manager said, yep. He gave me a team of about 10 people, and we ended up coming up with projects that lasted the team another 2 years. Now, this is not a normal thing. I often think about why that GM allowed me to have a 10-person team when I only had 3 years of experience. And I think it has to do, one, with trust. I built up credibility. But also, he was trying to build a culture that sponsored people who wanted to step up. So I want to talk about culture. And I think that's the last thing we've got to do here. So I'm going to pick on Mark again. Mark, I think, directionally was headed the right way. He had the Facebook motto is move fast and break things. That did set the stage for a culture of empowering individuals. I'm not sure if it's weathered the storm. I don't know how well this holds up over time. So let's not talk about Facebook. I want to give you guys an even better example. This is really one of my favorites, and I use this literally for every new team I start. I share some version of this. And if you haven't seen it, this is the Nordstrom Employee Handbook. So up until about, I think 20 years ago, Nordstrom printed out on a single card a handbook for every employee that came into their organization. And here's what it says. Welcome to Nordstrom. We're glad to have you with our company. Our number one goal is to provide outstanding customer service. Set both your personal and professional goals high. We have great confidence in your ability to achieve them. Nordstrom rules. Rule number 1, use your good judgment in all situations. There will be no additional rules. This is the most badass thing you can give to any new employee in your organization. Now, Nordstrom, I don't think they took this literally, but the point is it sets the tone. It sets the culture for your organization, all right? Now, there's other things that you can do in order to set that culture. So if you're a manager or an individual, I want to give you one tool that you can use. A lot of people haven't heard about this. It's a difference between sponsoring and mentoring. A lot of people, when I talk about building culture, they say, oh, we have a mentoring program. All right, mentoring programs are great. I like free coffee. But I want to tell you guys about sponsoring. The difference between sponsoring and mentoring is that with mentoring, someone comes to you for advice and you give them tips and feedback and so forth. Sponsoring is different. Sponsoring is if you're a person in a position of power, someone maybe high in the organization with the ability to grant authority, you can actually say, yeah, that's a good idea. I'm not only supportive of it and want to give you advice on it, but why don't we fund that idea? And there's lots of small ways that you can sponsor projects that many of the people in the room will be able to do. You can tell someone who works for you, or if you're an architect, someone you're mentoring, take my credibility, use it as a justification to work on this project in your spare time. I think that's the minimum you can do. You can also set aside hack days for projects that people are passionate about. You can dedicate time in the schedule. If you're someone like me who's managing the entire roadmap, I love to dedicate time in the schedule to make sure that people can work on passion projects. And if those projects are successful, I think your responsibility as a sponsor is to make sure that you give credit to whoever came up with the idea, all right? So mentoring versus sponsorship, take that back. Now, let's wrap it up. What happens when you put all these techniques together? To make a fire, you need oxygen, fuel, and a spark. To be a leader, I believe you need opportunity, passion, and permission, that culture, all right? Now, let's talk about some results. At Reddit and Looker, where I've been applying these techniques for, I guess, a couple years now. On the technical side, what you see here is, if you institute this, is a lot of great new tech bubbles up from the bottom of your organization. At Reddit, CI/CD performance testing started as a project that someone did in their spare time. We brought Kubernetes microservices to the organization through this methodology. One of the bigger projects at Reddit was porting the entire API over to GraphQL. Again, started from the bottoms up. The other really great thing about this is people contributions. It lends itself to a more positive culture. So we didn't have an employee mentoring program at Reddit or Looker. Those were started from the bottoms up. Deep learning and training guilds, if you like to have like technology guilds around specific areas of technology, those are great opportunities for people to step up and lead. And then the final thing that we see whenever I've done this is people using their time for nonprofit. And so Reddit for Good, as well as many Looker initiatives to benefit nonprofits that come up using these techniques. All right. So I've got just a few minutes left, and I want to close out my keynote with a few modern leadership tips. The first one is, leaders have to embrace change. Modern leaders have to embrace change. This is a chart of all of the different web frameworks that have come out since 1999 through 2016. I believe like 3 new web frameworks have been released while I've been giving this talk. You need to go learn them. But the important thing here is technology is changing all the time. If you're a leader, you have to be really, really open to new tech and change. And if your code is changing all the time, then what matters in the long run, right? So I believe it's your network in the long run. Your network is your net worth. The most valuable coding language you can learn is English, or whatever language, Spanish, et cetera, whatever your team is using. Communication is what matters over time. People and relationships, the value of that will outweigh the value of your code. Your code is a depreciating asset. The final thing I want to end on, and it's really the purpose of this talk, the reason I like to get up and try and tell you guys about these techniques. I think that anyone who finds himself in a leadership position has a responsibility to create new leaders. So it is my sincere hope that you'll take something from this talk, one of these tools back to you, back with you, and figure out a way how to deploy them in your own organizations. The thing you must remember, the purpose of this talk is that leaders make new leaders. All right. Okay, thank you.